One of the largest and grandest houses in Northampton is the Adrian and Cornell Mansion. Here it is sitting on a hillside, constructed of beautiful cut brownstone in the Italianate style. It is marked by a beautiful large belvedere on the roof, a bracketed cornice, and cut stone quoins. To the left of the main section of the house is a smaller two-story kitchen wing. This house was built at the cost of over $20,000 according to an 1860 newspaper account. One of the interesting features of a mid-19th century house are the round arches. You generally don't see this much before 1850 or 1860, and it is a different type of paneling than you would see a decade or two earlier. This is a very wide doorway, obviously. It's highlighted by a rectangular transom and these vertical side lights on top of paneled recesses. One of the nice things about a mid-19th century house is the combination of styles. This porch has got a lot of decorative elements that we refer to as Victorian period. It's got trefoil or three-lobed spandrels. It's got beautiful detailing on the columns themselves and unique brackets that are actually hollow or holes in them that are different than the brackets you see on the main roof. We are in the splendid dining room of the Adrian Cornell house on the Villa Joseph and Marie property. It's a classical revival room. The most obvious features in this beautiful room are the fluted columns and the matching pilasters. We have doorways which are tall, paneled, have a little shoulder above the doorway which is called a crochet, and in the center of the room is a splendid hutch. It has also got fluted pilasters, very fine detailing along the archways, keystones above these fancy windows, doors. And one of the interesting things about this whole unit is the fact there's a secret room behind it. If you see how deep these drawers come out, by comparison, the center section is very shallow and the drawers are very tiny. Historically, behind here, there was a secret area that could be used for either hiding valuables or perhaps, since this was built before the Civil War, hiding runaway slaves. It's often the story we hear in these old houses. Again, this is one of the most beautiful rooms you're going to see, and is emblematic and symptomatic of the money that Adrian Cornell had and put into this building. One of the things that gives this room so much life is the beautiful painted wallpaper throughout. Gives a lot of dimension and a little bit of outside look to a otherwise very large, would have been very white room. The kitchen of this house is also remarkable. It has an outstanding stove. In the mid-1860s, fireplaces were no longer as common for cooking. This was the state-of-the-art cooking utensil of the 1850s and 1860s. This is the area where the cooking was actually done, and like many of the old stoves, you have these round inserts. Above here was a warming area. When you bake something, you wanted to keep it warm, the radiant heat of the stove would keep it warm. The heating for this stove was by coal, and it was down here. These slide out. There's a grate to help improve the circulation of air, and then it could also be adjusted to allow more or less draft. And down here is the pit for the ashes, where the ashes would be swept out and dumped down into the basement. Again, this house was very, very well built, beautifully designed, and even the details on a utilitarian stove are very high quality. We are standing in the center hall of the Adrian Cornell Mansion at the Villa Joseph and Marie property. I'm leaning on the stairway that leads upstairs. It is in a remarkably tall stairway. In fact, there are 20 steps up to the first landing, and it goes up 3 full stories and all the way up to a tower up on the roof, as a matter of fact. This room is extremely tall, again, very well furnished. There's magnificent doorways with very interesting detailing on both the exterior and on the inside of the door frames themselves. The base of these doorway frames are wider than the tops. That's designed so that from a distance you don't get the idea that it's top heavy. With these big shoulders door would be out of proportion to your eye if this wasn't done. This is one of the many interesting little details that the builders of the 19th century recognized and used as part of their building technique. We are entering the parlor or sitting room of the Adrian Cornell house. It is a very large room, as some of the other rooms we saw were. What makes it even more large at times is the fact that these huge double doors can be thrown open so that you can have a party circulate in and out. When the Cornells entertained, this would undoubtedly be opened, and the front and back parlor would be one large room. Because this room is a little bit smaller than the other rooms, although it is a large room, the ceilings look even higher in here than they do in the rest of the house. It has very handsome, heavy cornice to bring your eye level up there, and a little bit of trim connecting the windows and doors. The parlor actually has a fireplace. By this time, the fireplace was more ornamental than it was functional. Although it did throw out heat, unlike the kitchen where you used the stove for cooking, this was as much for show as it was for anything else. Here we are at the Theodore Cornell Mansion. Theodore Cornell had this house built in 1885 on the site of the old Cornell farm, which appears in 19th century paintings by Edward Hicks. The house is very unusual in that it's eclectic with a variety of elements found in a number of styles. It is a brownstone house with random brownstone. It has some mansardic tower in the front and other details that are a combination of Queen Anne style, Italianate style, and Second Empire style. On the side of the house, you see these real nice two-story bay windows. And they provide some very interesting spaces on the inside. Above the windows, you see the slate siding. You have segmental slate, which in this case are highlighted with red paint, and regular standard butt-edged shingles. The bay windows have these cut corners, and above the cut corners, you see these detailed heavy brackets which support the third floor. The crowning element of the Theodore Cornell house is the tall mansard roof tower surmounted by a tiny little gable. The gable itself is highlighted with incised carvings and really is designed to crown the entire building. The story goes that Theodore Cornell wanted a tower higher than that on the house of his cousin Adrian Cornell, located across the valley from where we are. The 1848 painting by Edward Hicks of the Cornell farm shows the spring house and a bridge leading across a pathway to the former barn. Today, the bridge remains on a neighbor's property, and the spring house is still here, but not in very good condition. Hi. The first thing you notice when you walk in the Theodore Cornell Mansion is the rich doorway. It is a magnificently carved door, a double door, and a very elegant and unusual doorknob. Once inside the house, you're immediately drawn to this beautiful, large newel post. It's one of the most detailed ones you'll see in Northampton. Typical of the 1880s, it has a lot of different elements all into one thing. There's a very nicely detailed top, little dentils, larger dentils here, and a nice flower motif repeated several times on it. The newel post anchors a beautiful Victorian stairway that goes up 3 stories to the top of this magnificent mansion. Theodore Cornell was justifiably proud of his Victorian house. Not only does his name appear on the outside of the house, but his initials are carved into the etched glass above the transom. As we walk into the front parlor of the house, we see yet another example of the detailing that made Victorian homes so beautiful. This doorway has nice carving on the door itself, but the hardware is also outstandingly detailed and shows the high degree of sophistication we find in this mansion. This house retains a remarkable amount of detail. The jambs are paneled and match the panel pattern in the doors. The original windows, which are still pegged, and even the detailed Victorian sash hardware are all still evident in this house. But the highlight of the front parlor is the fireplace. It is a beautiful, beautiful cut and carved Italian marble fireplace. So some of the details are found in here, and a little bit hard to see, but all this incised tulips and detailing all the way down, and of course the rich multicolored marble itself makes this an outstanding example of a Victorian period fireplace. The fireplace is so nice, it's easy to forget to look up and see the beautiful plastered medallion and dramatic plastered cornice in this room. Wide pocket doors connect the front parlor to the rear parlor. Again, the doors are highlighted with the same carving we saw and yet more detailed hardware. The highlight of this room is this large alcove that's formed by the projecting bays we saw on the outside of the building. The Cornells ate in this bright, airy dining room. It is also beautiful. It has an alcove like we saw in the opposite corner of the house. And the medallion in this room, as we've seen in Victorian dining rooms before, reflects a food motif. Between the dining room and kitchen of the Cornell house is a servant's stair with an outside entrance. The transom here is red and not as ornate as the one on the front door, but again, another example of the detail that went into the Cornell's house. I'm on the porch of the Feaster homestead, a large stone house that was actually constructed in several phases. Architecturally and historically, the house really began from the left to the right. There are several clues that help us identify when each section was built. The oldest portion of the house dates from June 4th of 1764. How do we know that? Well, we're fortunate enough to have a date stone that tells us, with the initials for David Feaster. The original house actually ended right here, and you can see a vertical seam with the stone corner blocks facing this direction. What's unique about Northampton Township houses, particularly houses of the mid-18th century, is a recessed porch, which is probably based on a Dutch form called the stoop. The next section of the house extends out several feet beyond the doorway. What's interesting about this is if you look at it carefully, you can actually see above the roof line of the porch a small band of projecting stone which was used as a drip course. This was actually formed a protective barrier for a pent roof that was located where the front porch is now. This feature is generally found on houses before the Revolutionary War. If you look real carefully underneath the porch, every 2 or 3 feet or so, you can see pieces of wood or where stones are stuck in vertically that represented where the bottom of that extension protruded. One of the most remarkable things about this house is the size of the corner blocks or coins. These stones are all cut and dressed to make good, strong corners for the building. And when you realize how small this section was, it was a monumental effort to do that. And again, another little detail you see on old houses that's fascinating are the pegs which hold the old windows together. One of the remarkable things about the Feaster property is the number of these stone fence posts that we see all through the area. These were actually quarried out. You can see the marks where they were split with feathers and wedges, and then notched for the wooden rails. These stones were apparently quarried somewhere on or near the property and were used to enclose the fence lines and fence rows of the pastures. It's not only stone houses that mark Northampton's history. I'm standing at the gates of the historic Feaster Van Horn graveyard. We just left the Feaster farm, and this is known as the Feaster Van Horn Cemetery because of the names of the families that were buried here. It is a historic resource that's been listed on the County Register of Historic Places. And we also see on the wall the date of 1890 when at least a portion of the wall was erected. I'm standing in the portion of the Feaster Cemetery where the 18th century Feasters are buried. Right in front of me is the stone of David Feaster, whose house we saw, and you see it is marked by a Revolutionary War veteran symbol. We're in the Van Horn portion of the Feaster Van Horn Cemetery, and it is in fact the older section of this graveyard. The name Feaster Van Horn is given to this cemetery because that's the name of the two most common family names we see here, although Hageman and other family members who intermarried are also buried here. Since 1993, this graveyard has been taken care of by the Northampton Historic Commission as a project to help preserve the history of the township. Unlike some of the formal houses in Northampton Township, this house is what we call a vernacular or folk-style house. It has a real lack of symmetry and design elements. If you notice, the first floor and second floor window and door openings don't line up. This is one of the few ones we'll see like that on our tour of Northampton. This house is additive in nature. It was built in several sections. The section on this end, my left to your right, was the first section. And then there is an addition appended to the gable end. That addition has an 1838 date stone, which makes this section older. The house is interesting that it has a few decorative elements on the outside despite its vernacular or folk appearance. And these include a very fancy bracketed cornice with a ornate fascia board, very nice dormers, and when we walk around and see the date stone on the gable end, you see some gable end trim as well. Walking around the back of the house, we see a lot of other things that are interesting about this structure. Even though it's stuccoed, we can see a few clues as to how this place developed. First and foremost, you can see where the end of the house was. The old section of the house is much more rough than the new addition. And if you follow this rough section right through the window, which is a later addition, you can see the vertical line going up. And about 1.5 feet below the roof, you see where the top of the original section was. And when they put the addition on, they apparently raised the original section as well and made one uniform roof. The back of the house has even less symmetry than the front of the house. There's no rhythm or rhyme to the placement of the windows, and in fact there is no door opening at all left on this side. If we go around the front of the house, you can see how this really is reflected, that the first and second floor don't relate at all from an architectural point of view. We're now back around the front. Sometimes it's necessary to walk around the building several times when you see things that are confusing. Having looked at the back and seeing the lack of symmetry as expressed back there, coming back around here, we look at the doors again. First of all, it's unusual to have 4 openings on a building on the first floor and only 3 on the second. Here you have two front doors, and the window above them does not align up with either of them. Looking at it now more closely, we see a couple of things. One, there's a piece of wood between the doors, which is a nailer or may have been a lintel from where a door or another opening may have been. And secondly, if you look at the doors more carefully now, you realize they don't match. The door to my far right is larger, has a more formal opening, has blank corner blocks, but a very nice molded frame. And the section to the right is lower and doesn't line up at all with the other one. So maybe something has happened here through the years. Perhaps it was converted to a 2-family residence, or a lot may have happened. It's very difficult to understand vernacular houses and the changes that are made to them all through the years. I'm standing in front of another house known as the Adrian Cornell house, also known as the David Cornell house. What's most remarkable about this house at all is that it's standing. This house was going to be demolished as part of a residential subdivision, but the Northampton Historic Commission, with help from the Conservancy, was able to convince the developer to maintain it. Architecturally, the house is built in several sections. To my far right is a recessed porch, typical of the Dutch stoop that we found only in the Northampton area. Since that time, it has been filled in by the current owner. And then we have the main section of the house, and then a later addition. You can tell where the addition starts from where the former coins, the cut stones, end, and the more random stonework begins to be ended again with another set of cut stone coins or corner blocks. The windows on all the first floor, both sections, have cut keystones above them. It is another symbol of early 19th century style architecture here in Northampton to have this cut stone above the windows. The Adrian Cornell house has a federal style doorway with decorative lozenges at the top and some fluted pilasters down both sides. Typical of some of these historic homes of this period, the jambs of the recesses of the doorway match the paneling on the door itself. We're in the center hall of the Adrian Cornell House, also known as the David Cornell House. And the thing that strikes you about this area that we're in is the proportions. This is a magnificent center hall stairway. Notice the beautiful volutes and shapes here. Detailing here is quite exquisite. But the thing that's most amazing about it is the proportion is all wrong. This room is so low that the risers are only about 5 inches high. Normally risers are 7 to 9 inches high. And when you go up these stairs, the proportions are so unusual that even the ceiling had to be cut away a little bit so you don't bump your head. Coming around here, it's also evidenced when you look at this door. This door is obviously very short and very interestingly proportioned. The back door, or what used to lead out the back way, is also a relatively short door as compared to what you more typically or more commonly find in early 19th century houses. The Adrian Cornell House has a fine example of a Federal period fireplace. It is interesting. It has the shoulders or crossets. It has fluted pilasters and gouge work underneath the mantel shelf. The gouge work is then replicated or duplicated along the ceiling. One side of the fireplace, there are built-in closets. To the opposite side of the fireplace is the entrance way to get to the kitchen wing. This was the formal section of the house. Now we're in the kitchen wing of the Adrian Cornell House, and like most kitchens, there was a large fireplace. In this case, it is what we call a walk-in fireplace for the obvious reason, because you can walk in. It does not have a mantel shelf, but just a pure, simple lintel of oak, presumably. By its nature, a kitchen was less formal than the parlor, and in this case, we have open ceilings. You see the floor joists here. Floor joists are beaded, which means they were meant to be exposed, and then the floor of the second floor just exposed with no insulation and no other plaster work or anything else of that type of detail. These stairs typically wound one down to a basement or crawl space, and the second to the second floor level. You can always tell when you're walking through what used to be the end of an old house when you see these thick walls between the sections or rooms and the current structure. We're now in the addition on the Adrian Cornell House, and this fireplace, although Federal in design, is much different than the one we saw in the other room. Rather than the gouge work and the fluted pilasters, you have a paneled pilaster and these lozenges that are hand sculpted, which are similar to the ones we saw on the exterior front door as well. We're now on the second floor of the main section of the Adrian Cornell House. What we find here is another Federal period fireplace, decorative mantel, punch and gouge work, but it's not quite as formal as we saw on the first floor. That is what is generally the case in 18th and 19th century houses. People spent most of their time and money on the first floor where more of their neighbors and friends would see it. On the second floor here, we don't have a plastered ceiling, but we again have exposed beams, beaded floor joists, and other features that were very common in the 18th and early 19th century in Northampton Township. We hope you've enjoyed this edition of Northampton Revisited. As you can see from behind me, there's still a lot of beauty and historic charm in Holland and all of Northampton Township. On behalf of the Historic Commission and Heritage Conservancy, I want to thank you for joining us on this tour.